Wow, my hair is a mess. Okay. Ooh, sorry.
It's okay.
And we're live.
Hey guys, I'm Benzie.
And I'm Devin.
And this is our special guest, Alleliah. Welcome to the Holler Horror Hour. We're going to talk about Mother today, but Alleliah was actually also with us when we were watching The Feast, which our last episode was on. So we were having a conversation in the kitchen about what defines horror and some things from that movie. So and then I was like, wait, let's film this. So we're going to continue that conversation first before diving into Mother specifically. Now, what were you saying?
Well, I think we were just having a conversation over like what exactly constitutes horror, because I actually wouldn't call Mother a horror movie. I would attribute a lot of things to it the same way you'd attribute like thriller or what other like thriller comes to my mind. Thriller or suspense, but not necessarily horror to certain films.
Yeah, and I was saying that it's tricky, and on some level, I consider movies to be horror based on their content. For example, if anything has ghosts, I feel like that is a movie that is reminding us of our mortality and makes it inherently horrific, even if it's something like Casper or Ghostbusters.
Well, and I haven't seen Ghost, so I stopped short of naming that one because it's not good to reference something if you haven't seen it. But like I would put actually Casper into like Casper the Friendly Ghost into like the horror category, just because I think it does check the right boxes for horror for me. But I could imagine where like something could have ghosts or a werewolf, but I wouldn't call it a horror movie.
Oh, before we go any farther, Alleliah, tell us your credentials.
Sure.
She's truly credentialed.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Well,
not just our first guest, our first expert.
well, I have an MFA and a PhD in creative writing, poetry specifically. And during my PhD studies, horror was a huge component of what I was reading and writing about. I've just always have loved horror ever since I was a young child and watching Chucky when I still had dolls, and it scared me so much. And I'm still hooked. I just think it's simply the genre that has it all.
I agree.
Indeed.
So what about Mother? Is it horror? I think another important aspect of horror is how it makes you feel. And for me, it was a horrific experience watching it.
I would say that it was a horrific experience watching it. It definitely made me uncomfortable, but like still wouldn't call it a horror movie though. The same way that like what's it called? Uncut Gems that was the most uncomfortable watching experience I have ever had.
That's some Tusk.
Worse than Tusk, way worse than Tusk, which is saying something. But I wouldn't call it a horror movie.
I feel like Mother is a psychological horror.
Yeah, and I think it has aspects of the haunted house and also some very gory scenes.
Oh, yeah. They like eat a baby alive. I feel like there's lots of horror elements that like would not be attributable to something like Uncut Gems.
Yeah, I agree. I wouldn't put Mother and Uncut Gems in the same category at all, but that doesn't necessarily mean either of them would go into horror.
Okay.
Like, here's a question I'd pose. Is Blade a horror movie?
Hmm.
Do you know Blade, Alleliah?
I do not.
So it is the first Marvel movie, at least the first like of the modern Marvel movies that have come out, and it's a vampire hunter, but it has a lot of the style. It has a lot of like the same superhero type style that you see in other superhero movies, where like he's not really like you don't really get the same sense of fear and dread from the vampires in this, because Blade's a superhuman and he's able to go out and just the movie is more just him going after vampires and hunting them down, more in the same vein as like an action movie.
I feel like there's a thing where there's things that feel like this is horror and it's definitely just horror, and then there's like it's like metal music. There's a million subgenres, which each add like extra intricacy. So I would put Blade into more of like horror, action, superhero.
Yeah.
But I still feel like I would talk about Blade on this podcast with the name that this is like a horror focused podcast.
Yeah, and I think I would be willing to put Blade in like a horror category, and I wouldn't put it in a superhero category. I'd kind of put it in like, it does kind of fall into a category of its own because of some of the elements that it has.
Which I do think it'd be fun at some point to try and like build a map of like horror subgenres. Yeah.
Even like the difference between Alien and Aliens is kind of a weird one, because they still have largely a lot of the same elements, but Aliens comes off as much more of an action movie than Alien does.
Yeah, Alien is super sci-fi horror. And
Yeah.
Aliens feels like more sci-fi action.
A little bit.
Yeah. So now we all agree Mother is a horror film.
Yes, that is what we've definitely decided.
Well, and I think it's also fair to say that this is all...
Your hair is a horror film, right?
Now I'm Super Saiyan. Now half Super Saiyan.
Finish your sentence.
That all of these categories are subjective, and some people just aren't going to find certain things horrific.
Yeah, like we thought Skinamarink was not scary at all and just boring.
Yeah.
Did you watch that?
No, I haven't seen it.
I almost want to offer it up as like a test of like, do you think it's scary or do you not?
Well, I thought it was fun. Do think it's funny that Devin is the one saying that Mother isn't a horror, because it was literally like an embodiment of his nightmare.
Yeah.
And we've referenced it like multiple times since that movie, that it's like his version of hell.
But I think the reason I wouldn't call it a horror movie is...
I'm done with that part of the conversation now.
Okay, never mind. Never mind that. You should just throw one last jab in and change the topic. So let's just talk about Mother directly. Yeah?
Yeah.
Should we start with like, what is it about?
No, I hate when the only people watching this are people who watched Mother.
Only?
Well, literally, no one's watching actually. So, but
well, we're watching ourselves.
Yep, 3 viewers right here.
I actually didn't like Mother the first time I watched it. I was like, I didn't know what was going on the whole movie, and I found it more like frustrating than enjoyable. But then the second time I loved it, and then this was my third time watching it, and I loved it even more. And also, it was funny because in my memory, the movie was like way more psychedelic and all over the place. And then when we watched it this time, I was like, oh, there is like a plot and a storyline that I didn't recognize the previous times I watched it.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know if I benefited from being prepared by being told ahead of time that like it's hard to describe what this movie is about, because I think normally I would watch a movie like Mother where it's a little abstract, isn't necessarily about something concrete like guy goes to grocery store and then zombies attack.
Well, and you didn't like Beau is Afraid.
Yeah,
I feel like has very similar energy.
Yeah, I would agree with that, or I do agree with that. But so it's possible that I was mentally prepared for like what kind of movie to look for, or maybe even having watched Beau is Afraid, I was able to pick up on some of the elements of Mother a lot quicker than I was able to in Beau is Afraid, and just understand that like, okay, this is just a weird movie where weird shit happens, and this is spiraling. I would say, I do think also though that like one of the things that bothered me about Beau is Afraid is just how fucking long it was, and it tended to drag. Mother was a lot more concise with how it ran.
Alleliah, how many times have you seen Mother?
I've seen it between 5 and 7 times.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and every time I watch it, there's just something more there.
Well, you wrote papers on it and stuff too, right?
Mm-hmm. I spoke about it in my dissertation defense.
Yeah. Oh, wow. What was that like?
I don't know if I really want to get into the intricacies of that right now, but essentially, let's just leave it at, it was one of, in my PhD, I had some texts for my reading list that were movies because I was so focused on horror. Mother was one that I immediately thought to add to the list because it's a movie that has always sort of befuddled me in some ways, but there's just this interest there that I felt like I needed to explore. Rosemary's Baby was also on my list.
Oh, the original, or I don't know if it's the original, but the one from like the 60s, 70s?
I think from the 80s.
Is it the 80s?
Maybe 70s, but yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so what befuddled you about it?
That there's so much going on that I can't fully decide what the movie is about. All I knew was like it made me feel very strange inside. I see it as a sort of version of a home invasion movie. And that would be something cool to talk about because is it? Yes and no. There's like some sort of tacit acceptance of the visitors, which maybe makes it so that it's no longer an invasion. But yeah, and there's the ecological horror things, and then there's the horrors of motherhood and pregnancy and in general being a woman outside of that.
Yeah, it definitely has a lot going on with it.
Yeah, we kind of did 2 eco horrors in a row.
Yeah.
The feast.
Okay, I will just say one thing that I had brought up when we had talked about the movie right after we saw it the other week, that the movie begins and ends with the word baby. And it's interesting that baby doesn't refer to, the baby within the space of the movie, not the infant, but both times it refers to Javier Bardem's character, the poet.
Him.
And something else is that I realized that the word mother, if I am correct, is never spoken at all in the movie. It's the title, but one of your scrupulous listeners can read through the screenplay and say if I'm wrong. But I'm pretty sure that the word mother is never stated, as we see Jennifer Lawrence's character of Mother never really gets her fair share of credit at any point throughout the movie. And I don't believe she's ever referred to as a mother or acknowledged as such.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be I'm curious about that too, because like now that you mentioned that, I was kind of semi-listening for him. I think mainly because like we looked at, what are all the character names, and like, Javier Bardem is just called him, and then she's just Mother, and then there's Guy and like buddy or
Yeah.
something.
There's man and woman and possibly son.
Yeah, nobody seems to really have any names in the movie, so I was kind of listening for like the poet to be called him, or Jennifer Lawrence to be called Mother, and I don't think I ever heard it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the fact that no one has a name means that we're being inducted into this archetypal space with the poet and him and mother and so forth.
Yeah.
One moment that I caught this time around that I didn't notice the previous times was the speech that the poet gave to the parents of the like Cain and Abel characters. Mm-hmm. Then the priest was giving that speech to Jennifer Lawrence when her baby died. And remembering, like, I've never had like that level of experience, but when I had a lover pass away and like everything anybody said to me like pissed me off.
Yeah.
And I felt like resonance when I noticed that replication there.
Yeah, especially like in the movie, how the timeline is so accelerated because we essentially have the story of Christianity just squashed right in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that is another crazy aspect with the movie where like it's not really clear how long it takes place over, because even though she gets pregnant, she has a baby, and from that you might presume that so this takes place over the course of maybe a year. Some of the things that happen just happen so quickly that they don't seem to happen on a normal time scale. So even that maybe shouldn't be taken for granted. So I almost wonder, like, is this happening over the course of like really just a couple days or even longer maybe?
Yeah, I did wonder in their world, because like how much time is spent remodeling the house every time, imagining that it's a cycle that is happening over and over again. Is this like a 5-year cycle or a 1-year cycle, or like you said, is it days, and like even the people inside of it lose perception of time? Like,
yeah, well, and even like the implication at the end is that the house gets recycled, like with a thought from the poet or whatever happened there to kind of restore everything.
that was one thing. Is my thought was that she like did all the repairs on the house, but then when he does at the end, when he puts like the little rock there, the house kind of restores itself. So I was wondering, how much are the women doing? Like, what are they arriving to when there's a new woman?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and just based on the beginning of the film, I'm sort of assuming that we saw a cycle where we saw a cycle of creation, destruction, and then recreation again. That's presumably happened. Who knows
Infinite.
how? Yeah, could still be happening. May never stop. But it does kind of also call into question, like where is this all coming from? Is it all just a fabrication from the poet, or is it more complex than that?
Also, in like conjunction with the Barbie movie, which just came out and we watched, like, and I really enjoyed the Barbie movie, but it had a lot of like hoo-ha feminism in it. But I feel like Mother captured like the deep ingrained, like complex struggles of like existing as a woman so much better without trying to like verbalize the kinds of things the Barbie movie was trying to verbalize, I feel like.
Yeah, let's get into that a little bit more. Like, what are some examples? Because that's definitely one thing I personally found very horrifying about it, is seeing myself in Mother and seeing how I have allowed people to trespass and it's hard to get them out, how it feels like there's a point where it's too late to say no, and at that point they no longer will listen.
Yeah. Yeah, and definitely the like husband being appreciated throughout the whole movie for everything she is doing. And the like expectation of her to guess what people want. Like there's a part where the first guy comes in and it's like, do you want tea? Oh no. There's a bunch of like rejection, but then it's like she is fully expected to go make tea and bring it. And that is made clear through just like, your training and no one's going to communicate with you their needs. You need to be constantly predicting and providing people's needs without any communication. And anytime you fail at that, you will be harshly judged. Yeah. And definitely another moment that's sticking out to me too is when they like randomly start doing a funeral at her house unexpectedly, and she's been running around trying to like make things okay, and then the mother of the child that died, or the adult child, is like angry at her and then makes a comment that she like is wearing something inappropriate because she's still like in her nightgown essentially. And it was very much the like thanklessness of everything, and not just thankless, but like you're so inconsiderate. Kind of messaging towards her.
Yeah.
And also like an indication that the house at that point is no longer hers, because if it were her home, then she would be able to wear whatever she wants in it.
Yeah.
But then someone else has come in and started setting the rules.
That's something that resonated too, as someone who's dated a lot of like older men and like moved in with them, is that no matter how much work you put into something, or decorating or creating the space, or even like financial effort you put into a house, it like belongs to that man first. And unless you move and completely start over, it's pretty impossible for it to ever be your space. Or a shared space even.
Yeah, which is interesting in the context of this movie, because as we discover at the end of the film, the house comes from, I guess it's sort of both the poet and Mother, because we need in order for this house to exist, we need the poet to reach in and take that last bit of love that Mother has for him. Yeah. But then of course it's her own love that creates the home.
And the next mother.
Yeah. Yeah, she's a mother to mothers as well.
Yeah, that's true. Another thing too is the like, I just lost what I was gonna say. Never mind. But there's a million other things. So.
One thing that came to my mind was what the meaning behind the crystal being shattered was. Like, what were the implications of that, I wonder? Because presumably that was the mother that kind of recreated the house. I think you can maybe even circle that as the point where everything really starts to fall apart, maybe. But like, what was actually the importance of that crystal? Because like at the point that gets shattered, the poet kind of freaks out. He barricades the room off at that point. He seems like deeply upset that thing got destroyed. And that also seems to be the point where the visiting wife becomes quite a bit antagonistic towards Mother for righteously getting upset that you come into my house and breaking my shit, or not even her shit, but her husband's, or poets. They even say they're married.
Not explicitly.
But yeah. Like,
Does she call him her husband?
I don't remember. But anyway, like, he does seem deeply upset. So I do wonder, like, it's interesting that given that we've seemed to have kind of agreed that this could have repeated itself many times, and she is the umpteenth mother of who knows how many, he does still seem to put some value on what's left of the last one.
Which that makes sense to me in a context of like being non-monogamous, and like no matter if you have new partners or whatever, there's the individual intricacies of someone you've loved before. It can still feel painful to feel like you still want to feel that attachment. And also I might even think if he has like a deeper existence as like this eternal God that goes through this over and over, he might know that the physical reminder is his only connection to things long term, and that once it's gone, he knows like he will start to forget that person and forget their intricacies. So I can imagine that all causing things. But I also think it's a representation of how he is completely disconnected from anything being negative until something of his gets broken and doesn't care about all her stuff that's getting ruined.
But he didn't seem to have that same reaction like when his son gets shredded either.
Well, I think that is related to as well the idea of like men becoming jealous of their wives' like lit love for their children. I don't think it was entirely that, but I mean, and then obviously the like Jesus reference of like giving your son to be sacrificed.
Yeah, and the horror of transubstantiation.
What does that word mean?
Yeah, I was going to ask. That's a big word for me.
Yeah, essentially the I guess ritual in Catholic or Christian services where you drink the body, or you drink the blood of Christ and eat the body of Christ, and how like this movie shows that it's actually kind of horrific if you think about it. It's sort of cannibalistic, but in the movie it makes it more literal.
Yeah. Well, I think definitely too is I've seen in like other media too, like people in zombie situations or Snowpiercer, they talk about like babies tasting especially good, and it being like shameful to like know that and still like desire that flavor. Yeah. And I also think that represented too the idea of like no matter what age it is, for her it was like a newborn baby, but that there's this thing that happens in motherhood is you're spending like all your time and energy like creating a being, and no matter what, like how much you put into it, the world is going to take everything it can from your child and like maybe not destroy them from like existing and being like a whole person, but at the very least destroys on some level all the work that you do, like all your indoctrination, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting how him and Mother have these different approaches to creation, because they both engage in creative acts where Mother obviously is the mother of the home, the mother of the other mothers, and the mother of the baby, whereas the poet is a parent in a way in that he creates this work of art.
Yeah. Which I think follows the general idea of what we have around expectations of moms and dads societally.
Yeah. How the poet has, he has that instinctive desire to create, but then doesn't really have the follow through to take care of what he has created after. Even with his poem, he immediately presents it to the world and sort of, gives it to the world as a gift, but when that is self-serving.
Yeah.
Well, and he didn't seem to have any qualms either about like giving away like the whole house and everything to the world with an ironically self-centered notion of sharing with everyone while sacrificing, mother and everything that she valued to everyone else.
And it reminds me of like the idea of a lot of cults of like everyone's sharing everything, and that's really easy to say when you're at the fucking top of the pyramid and all your needs will always be met by everyone else who's like giving up a lot.
Yeah.
To be in a less predictable spot on the pyramid.
Well, it was interesting too, because like as they got like there's another scene later on where they're effectively holed up to kind of separate themselves from the mob, right? But then he's like, happily like presenting her with offerings from the mob as though like, look, see, this is wonderful. Like they're worshiping me, and like here, these are offerings from them. It's like, leaving out the bits that there at one point there was a literal war going on in the house, and that just like they literally had a house to themselves that he just okayed everybody else to come into and take whatever they want from.
Well, and that swing back and forth between like, I care about you so much and I'm going to be here and protect you. And then also I'm like literally the reason all of this is happening to you.
Yeah. And not to mention the parts where like he is notably absent when she is very much in distress.
Yeah. Well, and that line he has where it's like, I don't want them to leave,
Yeah.
So I'm only willing to like cater to you to the point of like my desires also being met.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that movie's like, I think that movie's like a master class in showing things without directly telling them.
Show don't tell. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it said more about the struggles of being a woman, the problems with religion, the problems with like celebrity culture in general. I think some of the dualities of being separate from society but still being affected by like the world and everything else around you. I think it said more about those topics than many movies that have, directly and pointedly been dedicated to any single one of those things.
It is funny that the poet boarded up his room. Like that, this whole house, anyone can come into it, do all these things, but my room is like boarded up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think he obviously didn't see it as that sacred because the guy, Ed Harris, he, when he first came over, he brought him into his room and showed him around. He didn't let him touch any certain things, but like he had no problem bringing him into his room and showing him around. The problem came when Ed Harris just took it upon himself to go back in there to show his wife, a room that wasn't his, and then broke something.
Yeah, well, and Mother explicitly says the rule of like he doesn't like people in here without him present or something like that.
Yeah. It's that same problem of like, yeah, these are the rules, and on some level, like she was speaking on his behalf, on the poet's behalf, but they don't actually respect her, so they don't really give a shit what she says.
Yeah.
It's like, getting one sibling to monitor another sibling, but the younger sibling, like, well, you're not mom and dad, so I don't give a shit what you say.
It does seem to me that the poet knows, at least on some level, that it's all going to happen again, that everything will be destroyed. And since the characters Ed Harris and his wife, I forget the actress's name, since they're man and woman, they seem to be like representative of Adam and Eve, and how I think it is, if I recall correctly, it is the woman who eventually does like break the crystal.
Mm-hmm.
Was it the woman? Yeah, maybe it was. That's also why, like, my general pitch that this movie is a metaphor for religion. The poet's God, Mother is Mother Earth, and like this is all a cycle of humans coming about and then destroying, ultimately like causing a massive suicide because they piss off Mother, wipes everything out, and then it just starts again. That's my pitch.
It makes me wish I had more knowledge about different religious systems to see, because I feel like Christianity is really easy because I have known it for so long to like pick up, oh, that's from that. But yeah, it makes me wish I knew more about other religions to see what kind of messaging from them are in there.
Yeah. Even within the Christian paradigm, it is interesting to think of the role that the poet plays as God, and how it seems that he has this really deep insecurity about being able to create. And I think that's where some of the hostility toward Mother comes from.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to that Mother's creation is like small, daily, and I mean, by small, I don't know what I'm saying, but it's like daily, consistent effort to create what she's creating, which is the home. And for him, it's like this inspiration, and then 3 days, and then when in my mind, I think like the best way to be inspired and like get that kind of thing would be to have like been working on the house together or something, and then like not just like sitting in a room being like, how do I be inspired?
Yeah,
like
they both create separately from each other.
Yeah. And then I think there's an element too of like, which I think this is like a trope in general of like the writer who can't write in his room. This idea of just like sitting there wishing you were creating something, being a useful activity, and then the man being like angry that like, oh, you think I'm doing nothing? I'm sitting there thinking, not that there's no value to that, but yeah.
Well, that was where like I do think there was more to that too, when like Ed Harris's character showed up as like an interest to him. Like I could kind of see from his perspective of like, this is an interesting dude, and he could inspire some ideas for me maybe, or like the poet and the way that he creates is such that like he needs to see interesting things, or just he bounces from spot to spot, looking for whatever might inspire an idea for him, whereas Mother's method is much more of a straightforward, like, let's play with some things, see what works, and a bit more of an X's and O's of creation.
Yeah, because that's actually represented when she does the one plaster color.
Yeah.
And then she's like, no, and she changes the plaster color.
Well, I think that even goes further too, in that like her art is creating a house which has somewhat of a defined structure. It has a defined area. There are some like there are a lot of X's and O's, basic things where that you can go through and check off to build a house. Whereas writing a good poem can be a bit more complex and doesn't necessarily follow the same creative process that creating a house is gonna follow.
As a poet person, what do you have to say about that, Alleliah?
Well, it's it's a movie that makes poets not look great. That's for sure.
Male poets.
Yeah, presenting the poet as someone who is sort of washed up and feels this desperate need to create again to stay relevant. And it seems to me in opposition to Mother's kind of mode of creation, where she has everything she needs basically within the house and within herself. The only exception is she needs the poet to make the baby, whereas the poet is just desperately grasping onto anything in order to get that inspiration again. I did think it was interesting thinking about celebrity in this movie. And the last time we watched it, I noticed something that I had never noticed before with the agent character that comes up, and how when we first see her, she's pretty innocuous. She's just having everyone line up and wait for their turn to see the poet. But then the second time we see her, she's in charge of a shooting squad.
Yeah.
And finds and stumbles upon Mother and tells them to finish her.
Yeah.
Which is interesting wording there, like to finish a person. But it seemed to me like representative of how, like, with putting creative work out into the world, if you involve publicity and sort of like angling your efforts in that direction, how inspiration can be sought out and essentially milked for all it's worth monetarily and then squashed.
Yeah. And I can see from an agent's perspective, it's like she already inspired it and we need something new ASAP. So like the quicker you get rid of her, the faster the new inspiration can get in.
Well, that actually brings to my mind also like a little more understanding of why the poet is so excited when he's got his audience now, because the way his creation works might be so much more fickle than the way Mother's creation works, and inspiration may be a lot more fleeting to him. So when he actually does do something good that inspires people despite the history, there might be you can maybe think that there's a habit that's been formed there where it takes a lot of creative juices to make that work, and it doesn't actually come as often as you might assume from the history, or at least it wasn't the case early on. And so he's developed a habit of, oh shit, I've got something, I got to live it up now, because like who knows when the next good poem might come.
Yeah. And also the idea of like when the Adam character arrives and he's like, it's so nice to talk to someone who's a fan of the work. And she's like, I love your work.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really common thing in relationships, is like you're with someone, spending all your time with them because you love them and are inspired by them, you know, or like they tell you you're beautiful every day or whatever. And it kind of becomes soft, in a way.
You take it for granted.
Yeah. And then some like random person on the street is like, oh my God, you're so beautiful. And that like feels like a fire that is hard to capture when someone you have known for 10 years tells you you're beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's kind of there's an understandable aspect to it, and kind of a, the icky aspect is obviously that, like, you are taking for granted, like the poet's taking for granted mother's love for him, and doesn't seem to value it as much as he probably should. Because, like, one of the big overarching questions throughout the movie is, like, why is he indulging in all this crap when why isn't she enough for him? But the flip side to that is that there is just something special about running into a complete stranger who, like, knows you for something, and for something that you did, something that you accomplished, and is a huge fan of something you did, absent, like, any personal connections or anything else. Like, it's almost, maybe it's like you've extended yourself across the world in a way.
Yeah. I think the idea of, like, striving for fame is really interesting in our culture in general. Like, I think there's a lot of people who, regardless of the path you take to get there, like, being famous is their dream. And I personally think, like in my ideal self could be, like, locally known in my town. Like, that sounds exciting to me. But being, like, widely famous feels terrifying and horrible. But yeah, so it is, like, personalities or whatever to desire that deeply or to not. Like, I don't think Mother would have enjoyed that attention even if it was focused on her.
Yeah, thinking about the poet's desperation for fame, I'm reminded of this book called The Gift by Lewis Hyde, and in it there's a little story about Gary Snyder, the West Coast poet, and he essentially said that he had written so many poems and it always felt like it was divinely bestowed, like it was a gift, and he would be happy even if he never wrote a poem again, because he had been given that gift so many times, and you can't really demand or extract a gift.
Yeah.
Whereas the poet, it seems like he has had his fame. He has had that divinely bestowed or whatever gift of poetry that he had written and had been appreciated for. But then it just, that wasn't enough for him. And the gifts that Mother is willing to offer were also not enough for him. So it does seem like sort of taking the wellspring and just draining it.
Yeah. Yeah, he definitely needs some meditation and gratitude.
Actually, that makes me wonder, like, what time does he take in between, like, cycles, mother cycles? Like, does he just go straight from one mother into the next version, or does he take any time to, like, reflect on one or the other?
I can't imagine him enjoying being alone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I take the ending sort of literally, with the sort of amount of time it takes for the house to be regenerated.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then too is it's like, if Jennifer Lawrence doing the baby thing is the beginning of the cycle, I guess I kind of already brought this up, but, like, is the woman's perception that she has been working on this house and she wakes up and it's already mostly fixed?
Yeah.
Or, yeah.
Presumably she still has the ability to, like, build that house. He just skips ahead a bit till the house is built.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and also she has no childhood, no family, no nothing. Like, I would love to know what's happening in the mother brain.
I'd actually love to know what is actually going on in his brain as he does this too, because, like, is, because I also have to wonder, like, how much of this is he creating, given that it seems like his favorite spot to be in would just be right in the middle of a big city with thousands of adoring fans. And if he's, I mean, I think it's pretty clear in the movie that he doesn't have that much control over what actually goes on instant to instant or cycle to cycle, because it's very clear that he can't fully control the crowd or anything. He can kind of influence it in different ways, but it's a bit like I don't know, well, like a cult leader or something, where when it reaches a certain size, like, you can make proclamations and kind of influence it one way or another, but ultimately individual people do what they do and make whatever decisions they want.
Yeah, in the God aspect, that reminds me of, like, I do lucid dreaming, and I remember in the beginning it was like, ooh, I can control everything in my dream, make this happen, and this happen, and this happen. But then eventually I was like, okay, I did all the things I want to do, so now I just want to, like, let dreams come to me, and I'll just be like a character in them, like a movie. So I kind of imagine that with him, like, maybe there were points where he was calculating and controlling what happened more. And eventually it was like the chaos is more fun than the calculation.
Well, maybe there's a bit too in there of he can't fully enjoy the high aspects of the cycle without first starting with those low aspects where it's just him and her, and he has to struggle with creation.
Well, I don't know if I'd call that low. Like, I think he probably enjoys both the, like, deep, intricate love of a singular woman and the, like, chaotic fandom.
Yeah, I didn't want to call it a low, more just that I think his favorite part is most definitely the part where the crowd's all there worshiping him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he seems to have more or less a good time throughout the whole fucking thing.
This is maybe tangentially related, but I'm reminded of the sort of refrain throughout the movie that different characters will say, that, like, it's okay, it's all fine.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And how, like, he's the first one to sort of say that, but then other characters say it too when it's very clearly not okay.
Yeah.
And there's also this interesting point early on in the movie where the poet fully projects it onto Mother, and he says to her, "You're always saying, oh, it's okay, and it's not okay," when she doesn't say that throughout the entire movie. He says that to her.
That's funny.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Yeah, and I wonder what it means. It looks like this sort of willful ignorance, just saying it's okay when the foundation is falling apart.
Yeah.
Well, and I also think there's an aspect too of, like, if somebody's coming to you with a bunch of problems and you're not, like, emotionally have that space, like, there is a temptation to be like, it's all going to be okay.
Yeah.
Like, kind of it's a bit of a conversation ender when someone's expressing, like, needs or pain.
Yeah. Yeah. I also actually think that's a reflection on the different ways that they approach things, where she seems to be much more of a sort of down to earth X's and O's type creator around the house. And to that end, her focus is on like our house is falling apart. Like we have random people showing up and murdering each other here. Like there's a crowd, there's a mob, like everything is chaos and going bad. They just ripped our son apart, and he doesn't really seem to care about any of that stuff up until, like, the things that he gets upset about seem to actually be like kind of smaller things in comparison, and much more like fickle. Like he gets angry when she's getting angry with him and not writing poets and everything, and he kind of that's where he gives that line of like, you're always telling me it's going to be okay. And then he gets angry when she won't let him hold his son, and she won't let him, and then he gets angry when, you know, his glass crystal breaks. And these all just seem like such small, fickle things in comparison to the things that she's getting upset and frustrated about.
Mm-hmm.
Even like she gets left alone after there was a fucking murderer in the house. Like, what is this?
Yeah. And the other lady who shames her for not being like hot enough, and she's like,
yeah,
this is why we won't fuck you.
Not trying to be sexy enough.
Yeah. When she's literally like one of the most like conventionally attractive people around right now.
Yeah.
You know?
Poor Jennifer Lawrence, just not attractive.
Which the next mother was also like a like thin blonde white woman too. So I wonder if there is also this element of like they all look the same but slightly different, you know.
Get them off the same conveyor belt that Fox News sources its reporters.
Oh my god.
Yeah, it is interesting that the poet remains the same, whereas the mother is always sort of replaceable.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess to that end, there could be because another thing comes to my mind where I've always had the thought that some of the way the poet creates and the abilities that he has to create poetry are actually a lot rarer than the creation abilities that Mother has to that end. Partially like going further from like his creation is a lot more fickle and short-lived, whereas I think because hers is a bit more grounded, it is a little bit easier for somebody else to kind of pick up the formula and see this is how it works. This is what you need to build a house, and then do it. Whereas the poet's ability to create a poem, and especially the way that he does it, like just pulling inspiration and waiting for the muses to speak to him, so to speak. Not everybody's going to be able to do that because there's not really a formula for it.
Yeah, that reminds me of I have a friend, Fiona, who's a poet, and I've said I can like see it in her eyes sometimes. It feels like there's like clouds of words above her head. She's like trying to grab them and like can't a lot of the time. Because I think because she's so beautiful with words, like it makes her super like long-winded and kind of even like difficult to listen to sometimes. But then like when you get those gems, it's like it's incredible and always like worthwhile in the end. So I do think it's magical.
Yeah.
But you don't got to be an asshole about it.
Poets.
Poets. It is always a mysterious process to me.
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but I do, sympathize with Javier Bardem's character. I know how frustrating it is. And I was talking earlier about poems being a sort of divinely bestowed gift, and how like when it's not currently, it feels like it's the capacity is not currently being gifted to you, how frustrating that is.
Yeah.
I'd probably expand art in general to that, or expand that to art in general, because like even even a painting can be very similarly elusive in what do we draw? What colors do we use here? Like what's going to look good? I mean, a lot of the stuff that you put together is like very abstracted sometimes, and you just grab ideas from various places. And you said it yourself, you never know like what's going to be something that's the next artistic endeavor.
Yeah. But I also really appreciate something we learned from we did the Neil Gaiman storytelling masterclass, and he talked about if you do stuff every day, if you just like create every day and some days you're inspired and some days you're not, that when he looks back on the year, he can't tell what he wrote when he was inspired and what he wrote on like begrudging days, because as a collective work, it's all inside of him.
Yeah, I've even found for myself that like, because I'm not much of an artist myself, but I have found that very often when I'm trying to do something artistic, one of the things that tends to be helpful for me is just kind of grinding through and forcing myself to put something down, because very often, even if like the initial thing isn't great or I'm not happy with it, the process of putting words down actually like maybe inspires better words or inspires something that I can, some direction I can go in.
I also resonated with Mother when she was trying to stay awake for that baby so that nobody could take it. And like the pain of like being incapable of paying attention to something as long as it needs sometimes, like the like physical barriers to that.
Yeah. Well, and being trapped in a spot where like she's literally just had her house stripped from her. Now she's got like her baby, which is the most important thing in her life, I would sort of assume, especially given that her house is a mess. And she's kind of stuck in this with a guy that she's very, very convinced that she cannot trust to like have anything to do with this baby, or cannot touch it.
Yeah, and I've thought before about like the deep pain it must take to be like a co-parent with someone you don't like trust or love anymore. And you have to like give your small child to someone and like not see them for days or a week at a time. And just like, because I've been at parties and stuff where people have a little kid that I know is being like co-parented, and I'm like, oh my God, if the mother knew where this baby was, like, how would they feel? Yeah, and so that really struck me in that.
Yeah, and how she knows from experience that the poet is unable to love anyone but himself, and that's why she's so resistant.
Yeah.
Well, not only that, but his proclivity to just give everything to the crowd.
Yeah. Yeah, this movie definitely also has a lot to say about like narcissistic abuse, which we didn't talk a lot about, but I guess we did. And like, it's all impossible not to talk about. But yeah. And during so one of the things in me and Devin's relationship is I'm the bringer of people into his sacred space.
You're the poet.
Not at that level, but but definitely.
Well, yeah, nobody's the poet at that level.
It was my first time watching this movie with Devin, and the whole time, and it was his first time watching it at all. And I definitely had feelings throughout the whole movie of like, oh my God, this is what I do to Devin. And since then too, we've even called it because like there was whole things with like, oh, this person's gonna spend the night tonight, this person's gonna spend the night tonight, and I was like, I'm sorry to mother you, is what I
we've had other conflicts too around like to what extent in our ideal visions of our lives, like to what extent the house is open for people to just come.
Yeah, in my ideal world, my home is actually a communal space that there's always people coming in and out of. And I think that's a conflict we might have our entire lives, is our different enjoyment levels of that.
Yeah, because in my ideal world, like my home is definitely not communal space. Like I'm okay with select people like showing up whenever or like surprise visits, but I don't want some random person just being there without my knowledge. Like that'd be a very uncomfortable experience for me.
And that brings up an interesting point about the movie, which is it purporting to say that we should not let anyone in? Because that is when things go wrong.
Yeah. Well, and I do feel like there are at two very interesting extremes, which will go, going back to like why the poet seems to be like the one constant in the whole cycle. But and so to that end, like why in the middle of nowhere? Why this big house in the middle of nowhere? Why not? I mean, why not a big house in the middle of a city? Like it is a very isolated existence, which seems like an extreme, like in my view, because I don't think I would want to be in. I don't know that I would want to be that isolated from everyone, but at the same time, like obviously where everything ends up, not with a war going on in my house, I'm assuming that wouldn't happen, but like with it just constantly being filled with strangers and strangers taking license to do whatever they want with her house, like that is definitely another extreme that I don't like to entertain.
Well, I do think part of it is that the poet needs Mother to have no friends, no interest besides him and his home.
Sorry, I wanted to throw out my question again because I'm still like thinking about it and I just don't know the answer. Is like, is the movie saying that we should have our walls up and not let people in?
Well, I think there is a point too that as unreasonable as everyone, I think literally everyone who comes into that movie outside of Mother, literally everyone is a very unreasonable person. I think there's a fair argument too that she's incredibly isolated from everybody else, and therefore like everybody just may just seem super unreasonable from the perspective we're being shown, because she's very much not part of the crowd, not connected with any part of the crowd whatsoever. She's like, it's like there's the crowd, there's the poet, and then there's her on the other side of him.
Yeah, I mean, when I think I have like such deep value around community, that it's hard for me to like resonate with messages of like intentional isolation. But I do think that is like a lot of people's dream, and a lot of people want that. And I wonder if the creator of this film wants that. And yeah, that is interesting. Because when I think of isolation, I think of like like capitalism wants people isolated.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, but this movie didn't express much nuance or in betweenness on the there's either all people here destroying stuff or there's no one here.
Mhm.
Yeah, community. Like, what actually is community here?
Yeah.
Mhm.
So yeah, I also wonder what the intention was around that.
Yeah. Yeah, it does seem to me to be a pretty cynical perspective. And I totally agree that that is sort of like a capitalist perspective of like, these are my walls, this is my house. You don't have the right to come in and do anything. And, you know, to an extent, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I almost wonder if that may just be a thing that the movie doesn't actually address that, because that's like, there's only so much metaphor you can squeeze out of a story, and that maybe just didn't fit with the story that was trying to be told.
Well, and there is an element too of like the person who made this movie is wealthy, and I do think like REC is having a problem. I do think like from my perspective, wealthier people are more isolationist, and even like they've done studies on people like seeing other people on the street and things like that, and wealthier people like have less vision of people around them and things like that. So yeah, that, I mean, I wonder what their values are.
Yeah, kind of similar with its presentation of the Christian paradigm and how it does seem pretty straightforwardly negative. So I wonder if it's just another sort of cynical take on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I wonder, like there was a lot of biblical scenes, but I do, thinking about it now, maybe if I watch it again I feel differently, but I'm right at this moment, I'm like, how deep was anything it said about the Bible? You know, versus just like replicating moments from it and characters from it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe, I mean, there's also a certain point where, like, you know, it's the death of the artist, where, you know, they kind of just, the creator just had his vision for a story and a movie and threw it out there, and, you know, maybe to the extent that Christianity's reference is just like, nah, that's a good one with some very obvious symbology to it that people will be able to recognize and pick up as, like, you know, there's a cult forming around this guy. Possible his thought process wasn't any deeper than that.
Well, and Aronofsky both wrote it and directed it. How did he know to put all that woman stuff in there?
Maybe he got some good advice from his wife or whoever. Actually, because like Godzilla has some very good female characters, and partially because one of the guys who was a big creative in that film and that franchise he was very wanted to make sure there was good female representation in the movies, and everything he came up with, he ran it by his wife and other women in his life. Like, is this a reasonable person? So it's possible Aronofsky did the same thing, or could do the same thing.
Well, and it is interesting. Yeah, well, now I'm thinking about some of his other movies. He does very, like, psychedelic type movies, usually. So...
Oh, yeah, I did Black Swan, too. That was a very...
Yeah, and Pi, and Requiem for a Dream.
Didn't see either of those.
And I thought he did Brazil, but that was actually Terry Gilliam once I looked it up later.
Well, Brazil is a much older movie than either of those two.
Yeah, but So I guess this might be like a projection, but I can't imagine somebody who's like really in touch with psychedelics also being into isolation. But then I'm thinking about that person we know, Rami, and he does a bunch of psychedelics, and he's also like super isolated all the time. So
Well, I mean, there's also a point where like psychedelics don't do the same thing to everybody. Like they're generalities, but like Rami is also a very different person from you or I. Like,
but I guess I feel like psychedelics, like they're known for making you feel like communal and like one with everything.
yeah, that's a big aspect of them, but it's not necessarily true for everybody.
I bet Aronofsky's doing a lot of drugs.
Yeah, there's no way he doesn't do drugs with a movie like Mother. I do wonder. That does make me wonder if he would identify more with Mother or more with the poet in the movie.
Yeah, maybe it's some shadow work.
Yeah.
Because it's possible that even though he might, even though like trying to make Mother the protagonist, that like, yeah, he sees himself as a sinner, so to speak.
Yeah, I could definitely see that, especially since he's making movies. I could imagine pressure of like, you're only as good as your last film kind of feelings and stuff. Yeah, I wonder where this came from inside of him.
Well, and he's a writer too.
Yeah, because I remember with like Midsummer, Ari Aster making statements that it was like a apology letter to an ex-girlfriend or something. I can't remember exactly what he said, but so that's definitely not like an unheard of way to do things. And I did look up his wife was born in 1970, so he's not like Leonardo DiCaprio-ing.
Oh yeah, like the poet who is Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yeah. But few people can Leonardo DiCaprio.
Oh my gosh, Alleliah, when we went and saw Oppenheimer the other night, and in the trailers, one of the trailers, I thought like, could they like not afford Leonardo DiCaprio and they just got someone who like looks like him but is like slightly uglier? And then it said it was Leonardo DiCaprio, and I was like, oh my god. I was shocked it was actually him.
That was hilarious to hear too.
Yeah, because I like whispered it to Devin like right before the name came up, and I was like, oh.
Yeah, I was like, yeah. I think by the time it clicked for me that you didn't realize that was Leonardo DiCaprio, like that you'd figured it out. I was like,
oh god. Anyways, tell us all your thoughts on Mother in the comments.
unless they're bad.
And Alleliah, why don't you tell everyone about your book that's coming out?
Sure.
All of our listeners promote you with our massive platform.
Okay, well, my debut collection of poetry is coming out in November from Dynamo Verlag Press, and it is called A Human Moon. And if there are any Tucson viewers, listeners out there, stay tuned. There will be a launch party in November.
Woo! Thanks for joining us, and we're very excited about everything in life.
Yay.
Yeah.